Welcome everyone to the final meeting, the final session of Thinking Through Photographs. And just want to say a huge thank you for everyone for coming tonight, and also for those of you who have been with us along the way. It's just really been, one of the real bright spots of this long pandemic, doing this programming with Liz and Emily and Kate and the whole Thinking Through Photographs crew. So a couple of announcements before I introduce John. One is you will all see a survey if you've attended any sessions of Thinking Through Photographs, with some questions, just looking for some feedback on this programming, what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it. And we would really, really appreciate it if you could take some time to give us some feedback on this program when you see that in the next week or so. Also, this isn't the end of our journey together. Over the summer, Liz and the University of Buffalo crew will begin thinking through monuments. So another really interesting thing to think through, and something I'm really excited about. I'm not a monuments expert, and so I'm excited to just join as an audience member and a reader and not a co-host. So that'll be really fun for me. And I think they've got some really exciting stuff planned for there. And I think Silver Eye is going to continue these conversations on Zoom about photography in the fall as well. So if you're not on Silver Eye's mailing list, make sure you sign up on our website, and we'll probably take the summer off from online programming. If you're Pittsburgh based, we might try to do some in-person reading groups. But if you want to find out any of that stuff, just join our mailing list, and make sure you also join UB Art Gallery's mailing list too, and you will find out about all this wonderful programming. And really just, if you're the kind of person who's here, that means you care about discourse and conversation and dialogue, and really thoughtfully digesting, I think, really interesting readings, and we want to continue that. But our last topic for tonight is how are photographs made, or how photographs are made, which I think is an interesting, important phrasing. And our facilitator tonight is my old friend John Opera, who we were just discussing how we've crossed that threshold from friends to old friends, which is pretty wild. In his photo-based work, John Opera combines a deep interest in the visual characteristics of natural and scientific phenomenon with a rigorous experimental approach to the techniques and apparatuses by which photographs have been defined and produced. Opera often returns to antiquated, but by no means exhausted photographic tools and processes, including pinhole imaging, and more recently cyanotypes and anthotypes. And I think John's work is some of the most interesting kind of, I think John is one of the most interesting thinkers about objects and the photographic objecthood that I've ever encountered as an artist. And so I thought this was the perfect chapter for him, because the perfect session for him, because I don't know of many people who think as much about what a photograph is and how it's made and what it kind of means. So he earned his BFA from SUNY New Paltz and his MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And he lived and worked and taught and exhibited in Chicago for more than a dozen years, which was where I came across John's work and John himself. And we were just sort of reminiscing when I had my first museum job as a kind of art handler at the Museum of Contemporary Photography when I was a graduate student. His was the first show that I helped to install, which was really lucky. It was a really amazing show. And I think a lot of work in that show will kind of speak to the Zelinska article that we're reading. A lot of that work that really directly addressed geology. He is the son of a geologist, as I learned while installing that show. And that show is a very special place in my heart, because I also gave something like 500 tours of it.
You're going to make me cry, David, but thank you.
And lest I would be remiss if I didn't mention that his work is the subject of a chapter from a forthcoming book called Promiscuous Entanglements, Photography, Referentiality, and the Objective Turn by David LaRocca and his chapter is entitled Object Lessons, What Cyanotypes Teach Us About Digital Media, coming from Leuven University Press later this year. So make sure you check that out. So that's enough ado. So how about you take over, John?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Liz, I forgot to ask the land acknowledgements. Are we doing that this evening? Sorry, everyone. I should have. I had this on a list of things to ask you about, but
you're always welcome to, John.
I don't have them in front of me.
Okay.
But, I'm terribly sorry.
Oh, no worries. I am always happy to as well.
Okay. I thought that was a gallery policy or. Anyway,
well.
Okay. Or we can do it at another point.
No, I'm happy to. I'm always happy to.
Okay.
The reason why why I always do a land acknowledgement is as a way to kind of commit and recommit to the work that we have to do to think about our implications and where we are coming from. And the University at Buffalo operates on the territory of Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. And the territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which is a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And it was also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the US government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed the Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. And the region to this day is still home to the Haudenosaunee people. And we are always grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory, like our event today. So thank you. And thanks for asking, John. I appreciate it.
I haven't been to every session, but all the ones that I attended, you did that. So obviously, David, thank you for that introduction. I'm incredibly honored to be here. I'm in very esteemed company. I want to thank Liz for inviting me to participate in this really interesting program. And of course, David Oresick, who also was instrumental in helping me figure out exactly what to what to cover and what to read. And I because the title is, well, let me start by sharing the screen. How about that? Let's do this. All right. And as David kind of implied, yeah, I mean, these are questions that I'm really fundamentally invested in and have been for some time. One of my professors in undergrad once told me this is territory that many pass through, but few linger in. I could never figure out if that was a compliment or some kind of veiled criticism, but somehow these types of questions have always just fascinated me as an artist. And I would just say, the title tonight being How Are Photographs Made, I think we could interchange that with what David was basically getting at. What are photographs? What is photography? And maybe even in terms of these two readings, where are photographs? Where can we actually identify them? So I'm going to speak, hopefully, when I practiced this twice, I did it in under 30 minutes, but we'll see. I'll really try to stay on track here and not fill up too much space and time. But what I'm essentially going to do is first cover the wall text and maybe interlace that a little bit with some things that have happened in my own work. And then I'm going to talk about another moment in my work that I think correlates to what Zielinska was getting at. And then I'm going to kind of unpack Zielinska in a very concise manner and prepare us for having a conversation. So hopefully that'll only take about 30 minutes. And I have to say before I get started too, the work that David mentioned, that's my earlier work, I actually am not including that work in this talk. It's one of the things I wanted to cut, but there is one image that I think at the end, if there's time, maybe I can share it, and I just have a couple of reflections about that particular image. So anyway, let's get going here. This is the photograph that Photography and Liquid Intelligence basically, Wall was inspired to write that text supposedly because of making this photo. And this talk really isn't about Jeff Wall. I personally have some problems with Wall at this point on certain levels, but this text really, for me, was fundamentally just a powerful influence on me. And so I still think there's a lot of value in it. I also think it's a great early example of this way of thinking towards non-humanism in a more enlightening, helpful kind of way. But if you don't know Wall, basically his strategy goes something like this, and this photograph is a perfect example of it. That his pictures mostly during this time period, and I would say including a lot of images he makes today, although now he's really turned more towards observational photography alongside this kind of theatrical mode. But basically, Wall observes things in the world and then subsequently adapts and restages these instances, these encounters as photographs with non-professional actors. And so that's about all I'm going to say about Wall. And I think for our purposes, I'm going to move on very quickly here and really talk about the text through these two images, which many of you probably recognize the image on the left. Liz reminded me or told me it's actually in the collection of UB Art Galleries. And this is Harold Edgerton's famous photograph from, I think it's 1957, I might be wrong there, called Milk Drop Coronet. And it's certainly an influence and an echo that I'm sure Wall was very aware of when he made Milk. And the image on the right is Harold Edgerton himself in his lab at MIT. And this image in particular, I just want to briefly explain just the importance of it. I would say it was a kind of monumental moment in the history of photography, in the sense that it was a moment that expanded human vision in a way that hadn't really been done previously. And I might compare this kind of event to, say, the first images we saw come through from the Hubble Space Telescope in the 1990s. It really, I think, has that kind of gravity. And it's because it does what Walter Benjamin and John Sarkowski talk about when they say that photographs expand human vision beyond our capabilities of just normal empiricism. And I think in a way it connects too with what Zelinska says when she says there have always been these non-human qualities to photography. I think this would be a shining example. So anyway, Jeff Wall's Liquid Intelligence. On the right, we have Edgerton in his studio, fiddling around with his apparatus. On the left, we have what Wall would call a complex natural form, or I think in this version of the text, he calls it a complicated natural form. There's actually several versions of that text floating around. But he basically sets up this kind of dialectic, or a kind of two-sided coin. There's the dry mechanical side, which is essentially what Edgerton represents there on the right. It's the kind of dry mechanical, the finite click of the shutter. It's the institutional side. And it has to do mostly with optics capturing light in a very specific way. Wall says in the text at some point, you certainly don't want water in your camera. And the dry side for me points to traditional ideas of humans controlling the world and perhaps the false promises of anthropocentrism. And to really, riff here, perhaps even the history of human exceptionalism. It's the overly rational part of photography, the part where rules shouldn't be broken. And I think it's also really connected to the history of apparatuses in general throughout human history itself. And it really has to do with the fact that measurements and outcomes from apparatuses are the result of how they're configured. The outcome is already determined by the structure of the camera or the system's design. And this in many ways is the basis of Wilhelm Flusser's critique in towards a philosophy of photography and towards the technical image. A thinker, Zielinska, mentioned several times throughout the book. But for Flusser, these conditions lead to repetitive and predictable outcomes. And I think we can revisit that idea when we talk about Penelope Ambreco's sun photographs. And so then there's the wet side. And this is basically the non-human side. It's the side that emerged, as Wall says in the text, from the mineral and vegetable worlds. And it's a profound and archaic part of photography that links it to the rest of human history. Wall says, he mentions things like mining, washing, dissolving. And Zielinska in her chapter connects the ideas of Harrison, who talks about impressioning in a very similar way. Maybe that's something we can circle back to and talk about more. But the important point here is that photography consists of a set of related phenomena, the chemical and the optical, that has been harnessed into what we call photography. So I really see this as kind of humanism versus non-humanism, or human control versus the nature of nature. That's a phrase that I borrow from David LaRocca, the author of that book chapter. Oopsies, let's see. All right, moving along. Okay, so these are all alternate takes. I just threw these in because you have to understand Edgerton photographed hundreds, if not thousands, of versions of each photograph before he achieved what he considered to be this kind of quintessential mechanically objective photograph. Another kind of interesting problem that pops up through the 20th century, but that's also for another talk. I want to just now shift a little bit towards the end of the text. He brings up Solaris, which for me is one of the kind of more haunting parts about this text that always make me really interested to revisit it. And if you haven't seen Andrei Tarkovsky's film, you should. I apologize. I'm probably going to give you a little bit of a spoiler, but not too much. Don't bother seeing the one with George Clooney. It's terrible. I mean, seriously, they shouldn't even have remade it. Actually, I don't know if it's terrible, but I can't imagine it being better than this. But in the film, there's an astronaut, and he's tasked with going to a space station that's orbiting an oceanic planet. They actually can't land on the planet, but scientists are there conducting experiments. And the film actually has a lot of interesting images that are kind of earthbound or terrestrial. There's almost a Thorovian vibe in parts of this film. And the two photographs we see on the left are the astronaut at the beginning of the film. He's walking around a pond and there's a cabin adjacent, but you can see cars driving by. It very much feels like something out of Thoreau's Walden. And once he goes up to the space station, things start to misfire. Reality starts to break down. And as maybe you could tell from the text, hallucinations kind of take over. And that's what we're looking at on the right-hand side. It's at the end of the film, and it's almost a shot-for-shot remake of what happened at the beginning, except kind of ends in a stranger way. So I'm just going to quickly read that last passage from this text. In Andrei Tarkovsky's film Solaris, some scientists are studying an oceanic planet. Their techniques are typically scientific, but the ocean is itself an intelligence which is studying them in turn. It experiments on the experimenters by returning their own memories to them in the form of hallucinations, perfect in every detail, in which people from their pasts appear in the present and must be related to once again, maybe in a new way. I think this was a very precise metaphor for, among many other things, the interrelation between liquid intelligence and optical intelligence in photography, or in technology as a whole. In photography, the liquids study us even from a great distance. And again, I think this argument is basically compatible with ideas around post-humanism, non-humanism, ideas that thinkers like Timothy Morton and Graham Harman are writing about with object-oriented ontology. And some other ontologies come to mind too. One that Zelinska mentioned is Karen Barad's, their theory around agential realism, which maybe we can work into the conversation a little later. But these ideas, I would say, pretty much carried me through this kind of earlier period of my work that David was referencing before. So kind of the years between 2003 and really maybe 2010, which was, you know, a decent amount of time. And it really was important to me because it made me realize that all photography basically consists of harnessed phenomena. In fact, really all of what constitutes the medium is much closer to nature than we allow ourselves to regularly acknowledge, as is the rest of, you know, human experience. We don't think of this Zoom call as nature, but it certainly is. And it really informed a body of work that I started around 2009, these anthotype photographs that I worked on for a little while, put on the back burner and returned to in 2015, and I'll kind of get into that. But it's a time period in my work where I started to really make tools. And it had a lot to do with this text I read, and around the same time, I discovered Wilhelm Flusser's Towards a Philosophy of Photography. And people who are close to me joke about how much I talk about Flusser. So I've really tried not to talk about him too much anymore. But I wanted to make apparatuses that were necessary for carrying out the images I wanted to make. And these are contact printing frames I made to expose the anthotypes under direct sunlight. And I had to come up with this system to press the negative really, really flat against the paper, so when the sun moved across the sky, it didn't cause a blur. And so I was starting to redefine my photography as a means to achieve results that I think were more tied to kind of my own idiosyncratic thought process and less to a solution that fit within prepackaged, you know, kind of programmatic structure we typically define as photography. And I would say this has really become the central concern and theme in my work, and has allowed me to basically experiment and do what I do. And the first anthotypes I made using this device, which I made this in a studio that I shared with Curtis Mann way back in the day. Another Chicago photographer David knows, who I think is now in Jersey. Anyway, I digress. But this device basically allowed me to expose 4x5 film directly to these liquid compositions that I made in this glass bottom tray. And I would basically fill the tray with mordant and ink and dye and actually some darkroom chemistry. And that allowed me to expose these images directly under in larger light. And it was the first time that I ever made a body of work too that was purely about abstraction. It was something that I always was trying to achieve in my work for various reasons I won't get into tonight. But that it was a real break from the work I was making previously, the work that David was referencing before. The anthotype, was invented by Sir John Herschel in 1840, who I'm sure all of you know was a polymath who studied a wide array of natural phenomena. He's known for inventing cyanotype and fix for silver-based images. And Herschel at one point basically turned to the garden as a site of experimentation for studying the properties of light in photosynthesis. And it seems his goal was really to reveal answers about rendering color in a photograph and figuring out the corresponding chemical reactions. So it was like he was doing all this by looking to nature and trying to find this stuff in nature. And this is a book I told Liz I was going to include here. This is a technical manual published in England in 1847. And so this is less than a decade after anthotypes were invented. But in it, there's a section on anthotypes, which was at that time a very contemporary process. And I just want to read you this passage because I think it's fascinating to think about the kinds of knowledge that was being shared in a photography manual at the time. It says, every person must have noticed the sickly appearance of vegetation. If grown in a place where light is partially excluded, the leaves are nearly white, And if the plant does flower and bear fruit, the leaves are pale and scentless and the fruit insipid. We have familiar examples of this when the gardener wishes to bleach celery or endive. He covers up the plants with earth, light is excluded and they become quite white. The interior of a cabbage is white, and for a similar reason. These are interesting facts. I love that. For they show how mutually dependent animals and plants are on one another. It is absolutely essential to animal life that the requisite quantity of oxygen should exist in the air. So just thinking about the ways Victorians were framing this medium, they were much closer to understanding connections, I think, to the natural world around them. You know, this is not a hard thing to grasp, I guess. But anyway, and that describes basically how anthotypes are created. So what are they? They're actually based on a positive process, and they require intense sunlight to kind of get the job done. They're made from various flower and fruit extracts that are light sensitive enough to be used as rudimentary print emulsions. And the print exposures, which I'm now doing in the greenhouse at UB, here's a setup here, typically take about a month to expose during the height of summer. And all are rendered in monochromatic kind of spectrum of reds and violets that are derived from their material sources. Blueberries, pokeberries, beets, and chokeberries. This is an image of me preparing paper with pokeberry. And since beginning this project in 2011, I've come to discover the fact that these images fade. They continue to fade even after the initial exposure. Really, they stick around for about 5-6 years. My father has one in his study that I gave him back in 2010, and he claims it still looks good, but it's a very dark room. And so some have completely disappeared, basically. And I've come to see this not as a problem to avoid, but instead a useful kind of conceptual layer that I think enriches their presence in time in the world. And at first, I did see this as a problem, and I won't get into the story because I don't think we have time for it, but it involves angry collectors and a gallerist who really didn't know how to respond to the situation. And so there was a point in which I kind of put these on hold, and I kind of returned to them in 2015 with these portraits of students. And so I'm really in the 6th year of this project. It's a very long-term project, but my intent with these images is to represent a demographically diverse model of humans in a system, a social system, in this case, art students today. Just as the subjects themselves symbolize a state of transformation from childhood towards adulthood, the newer photographs added to the collection point to a similar kind of renewal in death, as they replace earlier iterations that eventually fade and disappear. And so my hope is that over time, this body of work will illustrate itself as a kind of continually changing document of my teaching, and in addition, a work of art that displays a kind of ebb and flow of recording and erasure. And I think at this point, it's okay for me that they fade. In a strange way, I think it's comforting that there's really no choice in the matter. Anyway, so I'm gonna shift gears a little bit here and just talk about another body of work that I think has some kind of subtext going on that could be helpful for the conversation today. And these are a series of cyanotypes that I made between 2011 and 2015. I continue to use the cyanotype process today, but it really has moved more into the realm of the photographic concrete. And it's much more about the basic principles of light. In fact, right now I'm working on a new body of work around diffraction, which I wish we had time to include today, but we just don't. But these are blinds, obviously, images of melted blinds. And they were kind of like Wall's strategy in a way. They were based on things that I observed around Chicago, mostly in lower income neighborhoods or neighborhoods where there was a lot of underdevelopment or abandonment going on, which is precisely where my studio was in Chicago in Garfield Park. And so I kind of recreated this back in my studio. It's one example. Another kind of subject matter I was dealing with then was also literally the sun. In fact, these pictures of the sun were kind of the last representational photographs I made before I switched over to this kind of non-representational mode. But I just want to read to you very briefly about what this body of work for me is about. It says, a balance of photographic allegory and autobiography. The subjects of the cyanotypes are generic in their selection, yet targeted in their specificity. The references are broad and varied: melted Venetian blinds, telescopic pinhole views of the sun, ropes, hands, and fossils. The lack of strict categories within the collection of subjects reflects the ontological state of the pieces themselves. They are not exactly photographs and not exactly paintings, although their appearance and physical presence owe much to both photographic space and the less stringent qualities of painting space. Collectively, the images contain references to seeing, memory, and representation itself. The fossils reference the unfathomable registers of geologic time and the entirely fathomable assurances of death. The bottles and hands are direct references to observational drawing exercises usually given to beginning art students. The ropes and chains are just as much about connection and linkage as they are references to restraint and limitation. Their forms seem impossible to untangle and yet also suggestive of detachment and liberation. The collection of subjects functions as basically a broad set of signifiers for the generic human experience while also remaining mysteriously personal, the collection and its conceptual association. So they are in many ways, I think, similar to maybe the point Zelenska was making with Sugimoto's show. In a way, there's a kind of flat ontology going on here, to borrow a term from Graham Harman, in that all of the subjects represented seem to exist on equal footing. That was kind of my reason for pursuing this in the way that I did, including the elements that are human. The hands are basically the same as the bottles, which are the same as the fossils. There is no hierarchy, only a certain sense of incoherences and coherences that kind of, I think, phases in and out in a way. Really, they were subjects that were accessible in my daily life and surrounded me in my studio. So that's that. Now I want to kind of shift gears and let's talk about I'm going to basically just go through some main points in the Zelenska text and then as quickly as possible open it up to conversation. And I do have a couple other images such as the ones David was referring to. If there's time and it's relevant in our conversation, maybe I can pull it up. So this is actually, these are film stills from Zelenska's own practice as an artist. And I thought it was important to include that tonight because there are, parts of her identity. She is a working artist. And these are stills that I grabbed off of Vimeo last night. From a short film. I wish we had time to watch it together, but it's very accessible and I would check it out if I were you after tonight. But the film is called Exit Man, and it was meant to accompany her new book, or a recent book that was published out of this Minnesota University Press. They publish these really tiny books that are meant to bring scholars' research to the public in a very expedited fashion, faster than typically peer review happens. I mean, the book chapter I'm a part of, it's no longer relevant. It was started, I think, in 2017. 4 years later, it's in a book. But anyway, I want to just read to you an excerpt from the narrator in the film, which I think is Zelenska, and her voice is just slowed down. In the film, the narrator says, "The disavowing of cross-gender and cross-species kinship is a preservation of man's self-belief and self-appointed authority, allowing him continued dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." I think that's amazing. And so, I just wanted to have you get a sense of the kind of poetics that are at play, because in her writing, there certainly, I think, are certain, as a friend of mine who read this last night said, there are certain affects going on in her writing, which I think are kind of interesting. But so this chapter is, as I'm sure everyone is aware and knows, kind of takes the horizon of extinction as a reference point against which Zielinska thinks about photographic ontology and agency in the medium. She spends quite a bit of time talking about the role of light, not just in terms of how photographs are made and their relationship to, say, fossils, but life and death on a planetary scale. Towards the end, she mentions Leotard, and maybe we can get into that. That would be cool. But she wants to read photography as a light-induced process of fossilization occurring across different media. And when we're talking about extinction here, it's really important to understand that we're not talking about the future, but that's something that is already surrounding us, something that we are in the middle of that has not just a past, but an impending future. It's in the here and now, but there have also been, like I said, suggested, there have been 5 extinctions before us. We're just kind of unfortunately in the middle of what has been determined to be the 6th. She references biologist Ilka Hansky, who she says claims that because of our cognitive incapacity to perceive large scale and long-term changes, our present grasping of significant geological transformations is very limited. Basically, we are very out of touch with the concept of geologic or deep time or geologic time scales. And she kind of immediately reflects too that there is something self-defeating about philosophizing about this kind of stuff. And I would tend to agree. It can be depressing, I will tell you. But it also forces us to acknowledge that after we are gone, there will be basically no one to do philosophy or art, or at least the ways that we have shaped these practices. Again, something she kind of expands upon later in the chapter when she's talking about Leotard. What else? I love how she brings up this this polymath from the 19th century, William Jerome Harrison, who I ordered his book, or that book, from a used bookseller a couple weeks ago. I still haven't gotten it. I'm excited to check it out. But this person who wrote an early account, not just of the history of photography, but also a geologic survey of the English counties where he resided. And he, again, connects photography as a kind of impressioning. Impressioning is a process as ancient, he says, as the tanning of human skin under the sun or the bleaching of wax by the sun. Again, very compatible with what Wall's saying about the archaisms in water. Harrison says how beautifully photography exemplifies this theory of evolution, that process rises out of process. Or I would say, again, to borrow a term from David LaRocca, nature recording nature. And that, I think, a very important, super important, perhaps for me, I don't know, the most important, but something I really identify with, and I think has a lot of possibility of, reverie and thought, that Harrison seems to intimate that photography has always been there in a cosmic deep time. And I would just refer to a thought experiment I often ask students. I will say, who out there thinks it's a possibility that there are pinhole cameras on Mars right now? It's funny to get the looks. She then, I think, and something I think we can talk about too, I think she has really interesting observations about Bazin and Barthes, in that their ideas seem to serve human needs in retrospect as a way of achieving victory over time and death. And Zielinska said that this can be seen as the key representative of the humanist approach. She sees Harrison's work, interestingly enough, as transcending human desire and needs, and therefore Zielinska thinks this will help us to outline a different approach to the photographic medium and process. So that's some main points. I'm almost done. I just wanted to also go over, Liz and I were commenting on, it was an interesting group of artists she used. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's worth it. Here's Hiroshi Sugimoto, who show at the Palais de Tokyo, Lost Human Genetic Archive. I'm sure for the most part, Sugimoto doesn't need any introduction. But Zielinska describes this as a wonderkammer, or cabinet of curiosities, for the age of extinction in which new things popped up from around every crevice and corner on their way out with a bang. And I would say that you know, the flat ontology thing is kind of happening here. Sugimoto's asking us to consider all of these kind of entanglements on the same kind of plateau in order for us to kind of make sense of the senseless, maybe. But there are sex dolls, Barbie dolls, fossils, photographs, astronaut poo. You know, what academic uses the word poo? I think that alone just is a seal of approval. But one of the interesting things Sugimoto says too is, and maybe one of the more curious things that maybe we can unpack, imagining the worst conceivable tomorrows gives me tremendous pleasure. I think that might be a form of dark humor. But Zielinska says, you know, despite this kind of humorous, uncertain message, this is a show that is about where, the question is, where is this human race heading, incapable of preventing itself from being destroyed in the name of unchecked growth. There's a very, you know, iconic, emblematic photograph by Sugimoto, one of the pictures from his Horizon series. And then interestingly enough, she brings up Alexa Horachowski, who's a professor and artist based in Minneapolis. Her piece, Club Disminución, I don't know, I'm bad at Spanish, Club of Diminishing Returns. In this image, we have a trilobite fossil on the left, and I don't know if it was apparent, it was obvious in the reading, but that's a kind of fossilized credit card, an impression or indexical impression of a credit card. And I think the important thing, why I want to bring this up, is because this is another underlying concern with Zielinska, it seems, is how the narrative of the Anthropocene has been gendered. And she says that this, not only does this blur the boundaries between human and what we call nature, but it also pushes against the narrative of seamless unification between citizens and the environments, and all the while kind of playing off modernist tropes. I think it's kind of interesting, both Sugimoto and this artist, I was kind of joking with Liz, there's like a lot of rusted metal, a very rustic kind of aesthetic going on here. And I think the important thing here that I want to maybe underline and emphasize, Christina Schmidt, who's an art theorist and looks like professor out in Minneapolis, she's also written for Art Forum, says that the artist, you know, Horachowski, more than vaguely vaginal imagery, suggests a gendering of the dialogue. It challenges macho modernism's tragic, heroic quest for mastery. And she goes on to say, so often evident, Zielinska, this is Zielinska, in the Jeremiads by various Anthropocene era male prophets of doom and gloom, who seem to take delight in pronouncing our imminent death. And I would say a friend of mine once called this kind of art that celebrates problems. But Jeremiad, that's she loves this word. She uses it a lot, and it's, you know, a kind of long, mournful lament, a list of woes. So we're almost done here. And last, well, second to last, is this Penelope Ambreco piece. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it because Daniel Lears talked a lot about it in the second session. But I will just say, you know, to recap, I think his observation and also basically what Ambreco is saying is that this is a work about repetition and collective experience through online sharing. I think one of the more poetic things Ambreco says, though, is that suggesting that light from the sun has been basically displaced onto our personal screens, emitting light. And this is now kind of our relationship to the cosmos, you know, through this very specific collective mediation. But I also think this is a perfect example and expression of the automatic repetition that Flusur warned us about, that everybody is basically having the same cookie cutter experience, and that photography is not necessarily a generative medium unless you make it that. Typically, it's a medium about recognition, that we make photographs that we know will be successful because we've seen them before. And I would say that this is the case with any representational photograph, whether it's you know, a fine art photograph or something from the vernacular. So then she starts talking about Leotard and embodiment. In his stuff, meta-narrative, just heavy stuff. After the sun's death, there won't be a thought to know that its death took place. Zielinska points out that the universe will know somehow. I think this is an interesting insight, though it will go way beyond human communication and models and structures. That reminds me again of Wall's Oceanic Planet in Solaris. And then almost done here, this is, I think, important to bring up because I think this could be an interesting conversation point. She goes on to discuss Burtynsky's oil field photographs and points out the importance, she points out the importance of the documentary mode right now in terms of bearing witness to what's happening, and that the documentary mode is kind of like a geology in itself, that this is an accumulation of the archive, and it's a way that the Earth records itself. However, she also says, and I'll just end on this basically, because the chapter does kind of, as Liz observed, fizzles out. There isn't really a strong ending, except I think she ends it with this question around ethics, which is, I think, a good place to end on. But she also says there is also a danger that these images will actually perpetuate the act of forgetting about the sun, with aesthetics acting as an anesthetic against the urgency of the environmental issue. And no one can deny. I remember in graduate school, Hamza Walker at SAIC basically told us, you want to know what's happening in the sublime today? Look at Edward Burtynsky. These are unabashedly beautiful photographs of, I won't say the expletive that Hamza used, but he was trying to, drive the point home there. And she says, though, indeed, sentimentalism or moral outrage aside, visual oversaturation may actually lead to non-action. And I'm gonna end there because I've been talking plenty here, and I don't want to fill up too much time and space. But yeah, I guess that's that. Not bad, not great, but not bad. I tried. Try to keep it short. Anyway, so how do we proceed?
So thank you, John, for that really wonderful presentation. I think it really helped me, I think, clarify a bunch of things I've been kicking around. So now we really open it up, and feel free to use the chat or just unmute yourself and chime in, or use the hand raise feature if you have an observation or a discussion or a place you want to start. Maybe maybe I'll just start with a kind of feeling that I've been thinking about, that I think you clarified for me, John, which was, I think when you first suggested the Jeff Wall and you told me it was important to your practice, I'd probably read it a long time ago and really not thought about it much since. And I was a little bit like, I think there's probably, if John says there's something there, there is, and I'll kind of go with it. But I think you really clarified to me the basic tension of photography that, I think comes up so many times in so many ways, and has come up so many times again and again this reading group, which is like the precision of the apparatus versus the kind of messiness of the world. And how I think maybe this is going too far, but maybe, Zielinska kind of points out like that actually the way that we've come to think of those two things as sort of separate in opposition to each other, but they're not so separate really, right? They're kind of the same, part of the same thing.
Yeah, yes, they really are. And when Wall sets up that kind of dialectic in a way, I would argue that's not exactly in line with how things are thought through today. And again, I wish I could. I want to meet Karen Barad one day, but in the second chapter, Zielinska mentions Karen Barad, and Barad's theories around agential realism really put everything under the same umbrella, that there is no such thing as an interaction. Barad says everything intra-acts, that we are already a part of the same space, we're part of the same field, medium, whatever it is you want to however you want to describe it, but that the universe consists of basically just phenomena bumping into one another, creating diffraction, creating differences. And that's how also Barad explains the apparatus, where it's kind of hard for Barad to determine where a microscope begins and ends. Does it, it can include the user in all of the pitfalls of observation in the room, the users and the humidity, the day the specimen was observed, and so on and so forth. Rambling here, but yeah, I mean, this is also, I think this is heavy stuff. It's dense stuff. And I've kind of entered it through many different points over time. And I feel like, yeah, the stuff with the stuff you're talking about, I think it takes a little time in reading to see where it's at today. Anyway, I mean, I mean, I would pose a question to the audience about this idea of documentary and bearing witness, but also the inherent program in photography that insists on aestheticizing everything. I think that's a really, really interesting thing to think about. And this also goes back to an idea Zielinski, I think, was hashing out more in that second chapter about the creative uses of thinking about non-humanism in photography. That, oh my God, I just totally drew a blank. What was I just saying? I got my second shot the other day. Wait, what was I just totally lost my train of thought. My God, it's terrible. Zielinski, oh, this idea, oh, I know it is. That not only, I think she emphasizes the documentary stuff in this chapter more, but in earlier chapters, she also, I think, insists on, when she talks about Flusur, she's really hyped up and interested in unfastening the apparatus, the entire apparatus of photography, in a way that expands our definition of the medium. So I guess, what does it mean when we should be bearing witness in this documentary mode, but also inventing new forms, or thinking about the fossil itself as a photograph? I mean, well, what kind of work do we have to do, not just in terms of social justice and observing, but also inventing new forms, or not even inventing new forms, but identifying forms that have previously maybe been dormant. And Timothy Morton writes about this a lot, that right now we need a lot of different people doing a lot of different inquiries into what constitutes our world, and these are all kind of intertwined. Anyway, my question is, I don't know what my question is, but I think it's an interesting thing to riff on and think about. I don't know if anyone has any comments, thoughts. Oh, No Offense. No Offense raised his hand. No Offense, and I have to say, shout out to No Offense. We are reading Totality and Infinity, Levinas, Ethics. So Noah, take it away. What's your question or thought?
Yeah, just going off something David said, and I guess maybe just sort of answering your question, John, with another question.
Okay, great.
I liked what David was getting at. I think that there's, the way I would put it is that there's like this futile enterprise of mapping the human relationship between our perception and the external world onto the relationship that photographs or even fossils have with the world. And so, the way I'm looking at this reading, in some sense, like a fossil, a photo is already the world. So it's already the world itself. And the human dimension that we sort of add to things is like invariably abstracts away from that. And sort of photographs or fossils get subsumed as objects of perception. So it's sort of the question of like, what are the possibilities for photography, and giving up that feudal enterprise, I guess, is, yeah, to answer the question with a question.
As a typical philosophy student would do, but yes. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. That is the question. Yeah. What else? I mean, don't all, don't all beat down the door at once. Oh, Benjamin had a question. Hi, oh, and Robert George has one. But Liz, should I read the questions?
Oh, sure. Yes, please.
Okay. Benjamin writes, I had a question related to the fossil. Why does Zielinska claim photography as fossilization is oriented to the future? I had always thought of fossils as being about evidence of the past. And aren't fossils also connected to traditions of photography as salvage? That's a cool question. Anyone else? I mean, I've talked a lot already. I can certainly answer what I think, but should I proceed? I mean, I think one of the things Zielinska wants us to think about maybe is also, well, I would say, okay, for one, I think when we talk about post-humanism, we're talking about a temporal kind of component, that it's whatever has played out in terms of humanistic virtue up until this point. I think maybe we could substitute with like late humanism, where non-humanism, I think, encompasses a more atemporal, non-temporal, time is a flat circle from True Detectives kind of space. And so, I mean, fossils are really, when she talks about fossilization as being the future, I think we need to understand this is our destiny. This is where we're headed. At one point, she says that everything, all the museums, all the sculpture, all the factories, everything, all the great works of art will be reduced down to a layer no thinner than cigarette paper, which is pretty dark, but also very poetic. So I don't know. I think it's understanding that we're just here. We're along for the ride, and that's kind of where it's headed. That's how I would interpret it anyway.
I guess my response to the last part of Benjamin's question, yeah, fossils are absolutely connected to photographic tradition. And I think this is pointing back to when Zielinska says Earth as a recording device. And I think also connecting that back to what David was talking about, there is this notion of the apparatus that both Wall and Zielinska are grappling with actively, and perhaps trying to take it apart, so that we're talking about photography as exceeding that of the camera, the invention of the camera, that photography is something that exists in deep time, independent of the apparatus.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, I don't remember where I heard this in a lecture, but someone posited it's possible it could be raining silver nitrate on a planet somewhere right now. And that, as everyone might know, is, main ingredient in photo light sensitivity.
So, I mean, just to go on that, I was thinking, just even so many practices where people essentially use, like, I think this is what Benjamin means, and maybe you can chime in and clarify with photography as salvage, is like how many practices just kind of, for decades, just riff on existing photographs in a way that has no real concern for authorship or concern for really only under the vaguest terms of like where they came from, and they're really seen as a kind of raw material, like a just naturally existing raw material, like any kind of geology, which makes me think of some of that Bertinsky as well. But Robert's had his hand up for a while, so
yes, Robert George, hello.
Hey,
good to see you.
It's nice seeing you as well. I liked your talk. So with the Zielinska reading, the whole time I couldn't help but to find it strangely optimistic in its I don't know, cynical understanding of our current position. But at the end, when they got to the quote about digital modes being contingent upon light borrowed from oil, a light distilled from death, I couldn't help but to think about the current hot button issue of NFTs and how we've moved into a very like anthropogenic mode of selling art. And I'm wondering how you think that current state would affect this reading, and do you think it kind of plays into it? Should we, love the bomb, or should we, kind of stop it? What do you think?
You mean it's a post-cynical time? It's like post-cynical art. I mean, I think it's a grift. I mean, it's like techno nerds are trying to figure out a way to make money fast. It's about betting. Nando raised his hand. But I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to engage with the NFT thing very much. I think it's like, for me, it's what's happening with the rest of the stock market. It's like whatever you can commodify and turn a dime on and, call it experimental and fun, but it's just perpetuating kind of, late capitalism in the worst kind of ways. But I don't know. I mean, I also don't really care. I don't know. I don't think of it's like a bad, like Wall said, and I don't think of it as bad or good. I don't know. I'm not interested in the discourse. I think it's kind of stupid, frankly. But when Jerry Saltz is trying to sell NFTs, you got to kind of take pause or something. But sorry, Liz.
I want to see if Michael has a response, because I think Michael's comment in the chat is a really interesting way to think about digital technology in relation to our reading. Michael, do you want to unmute and chime in? You also don't have to.
No, that's fine. Hi. I just got back from walking my dog, but I was listening. And yeah, as I was doing the reading, I kept thinking about the poor image, Stowe's poor image, and then as the conversation was going, and thinking about like this idea of aesthetics and the sublime and Bertinsky, then I thought like, well, maybe that kind of image has a limit in terms of its capacity to convey truth or to record. But then the fossil, I don't know, I hadn't thought about the fossil as being a poor image before, but like the way that rather than like moving around digital space, it kind of has persevered through time and traveled in that way. So I don't know, it's not really a question. I just thought it was kind of an interesting correlation.
That's awesome. I think you need to write a paper about that or something. That's really cool. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I gotta think about that. But I think that's totally a wild, interesting connection. Yeah.
I love the fossil as poor image. I'm gonna chew on it. But I bet Nando has an NFT take for us.
All right, Nando.
To us, Nando.
Hey guys, bear with me. I'm making dinner, but I don't really have a comment on NFTs that much. Although I guess it ties in a bit. There's like, obviously in both The Wall and Zielinska, there is a question that is the first lurking and then coming up quite urgently about ecological crisis. And I feel like in both of them, there's a kind of like, I feel like Zielinska addresses sort of responsibility more, but it ends in a place of kind of like almost like reverie and like thinking about how much of a husk the world will be soon. And so, yeah, I guess I have a question for anyone here about kind of where we see, especially within object-based practices, the role that artists can play. It's when we take into account questions of like, we're always essentially kind of addressing an audience in the know, address liberal. So this question of once you know the thing, what do you actually do? And the NFTs are interesting case because, of course, there's already talk about like, you know, there'll be some new algorithm in this like proof of stake stuff that reduces the ecological impact. But it has been interesting to see, you know, artists who generally identify as progressive and like ecologically minded jump into this game in a really like aggressive and I won't say it's thoughtless, but it has been a real gold rush that I think has like not shown well on both collectors, but that's like duh, but really on artists too.
Getting polemical there. I like it. Yeah, Liz or David or anyone, does anyone want to respond to that? I've talked a lot. I don't want to, but I do have a thought.
I could jump in. I mean, I was thinking
Hey,
about
Becky Brown.
hey
What's
everyone.
up?
Yeah, John, great to hear and see some more of your work in the context of these readings. But yeah, to some of what Nando was saying and to some of what Michael was saying, yeah, I too found myself thinking in reading this that it sort of makes you wonder what is left for the artist to do or for the human to do, right? I mean, I guess the book is called Non-Human Photography, so maybe that should have been obvious, but or one of her books. But like when she's kind of talking about the earth is a photograph and the human being is a photograph and everything is a photograph, like it almost it seems to sort of circle around a little bit. So I was curious what people thought about that in terms of like what do we do? You know, in a way, John, your work is a little bit of an answer to that question because you're kind of creating tools to help the earth do this process in some sense. But I also was thinking about the idea of fossils, and I love the idea of connecting it to a poor image. But in some sense, I feel like in Sturl's sense, you know, the image is losing quality each time, right? But the fossil is never less accurate, right? Like a fossil never lies to some extent, right? Or does it? I guess that's something that I was thinking about when she's comparing a photograph to a fossil, because a fossil is like, is there any way that a fossil could be a fiction? These are things that I was starting to wonder, especially because photographs, you know,
ask
nowadays
a creationist.
are usually
you'll have to ask creationists. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right. I guess that's true. So yeah, in that sense, for sure. But I mean, photographs are, you know, at least the way we think of them now, not so much in her reading, but you know, we're used to viewing them with the possibility of fiction, right? Which is so different than how we look at fossils. So I don't know. I was curious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would just address that. I mean, I in terms of like photography and truth, the truth claim behind photography, which is also one of these ongoing, ambivalent, never-ending conversations. I mean, I would in a way say it's not necessarily whether, and that's a good point. I think that Michael needs to then address in his paper that he's going to write about the poor image, but that it's not necessarily about truth. Although that's part of it for photography. I think it's more about natural processes and this like impressioning that she brings up that Harrison says, or what Rosalind Krauss calls indexicality, that there's, you know, to borrow a Duchampian term, something very infra-thin going on between the subject and or the object rather, and its representation. I mean, I think, you know, yeah, I don't know. That's where I go with that. But then the question about what do we do? I don't know. I mean, I think this is, I think it's in a lot of ways challenging this idea that humanistic virtue always leads to good things. And the fact is, under humanism, we've actually dehumanized a lot of humans. And I don't need to run the list of litanies, although, you know, today, thank God, you know, a verdict came in that is, you know, shows some kind of justice. But I think that's also one of the misreads of non-humanism, that it somehow you know, is the sky is falling, and this is really about, you know, that we need more humanism. We don't need, you know, non-humanism, post-humanism is bad, but I think for me, it's more about a paradigm shift and understanding that we only have one Earth. We're all on Earth. We're all part of Earth. We're not separate from it. And a lot of what Zielinska is also concerned with is basically dissolving this traditional subject-object relationship where we're all kind of part of this. And I don't know. I mean, it's dark, but it's also, I think, if we understand where we are, then maybe there's a liberation about that. I mean, Timothy Morton writes a lot about that, in his book, Dark Ecology. Dark Ecology is a book that's basically about accepting the fact that we're not going to be here forever and that we should embrace it and celebrate it. Sorry, anyway, rambling, but any other, I mean, and I keep saying I won't talk, but then I talk. I don't know if we ever addressed Nando's question. Did we entirely?
Well, Liz just threw in a quote of Zielinska addressing humanism, which what I was kind of thinking when you say, like, what do we do? And my first thought was like, oh, fuck, we're just going to run back to humanism and just sort of make the cycle go even faster. But Liz, do you want to talk about the quote you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I
Yes,
just thought
yes,
it would
yes.
be helpful for all of us to go back to the text and read the part where she says, I am proposing to do this, not to inject a dose of humanism into our debate, but to avoid what Donna Haraway has criticized as a view from nowhere, a view that ends up smuggling back the usually white, straight male human into the debate under the umbrella of its supposed non-human perspective, which I think is a perfect explanation of her.
Is that later in the text?
No, it's on page 53.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there she is.
Yeah, totally. That's part of the problem. That's a big part of it. That is the problem.
Hey, Leo, you've had your hand up for a minute. What are you thinking about?
Sorry. Yeah. Hi, Leo.
Hey. I was actually thinking about when Becky was speaking and John, your response. I was thinking about, John, your photographs that were fading, these portraits, and very much a sense that I got from this reading was thinking about even geological time, even this longue durée, is still time that's moving, and that is a challenge to the idea of artworks that simply come into being and then there they are and they're never going to change. And so this feeling of humility, I think, that she's trying to get across, that they're trying to get across, that is about considering what the life of a photograph could be if it was thought of geologically. And so I think this possibility of work that fades, that transforms, I don't even want to say it decays, but that it is existing in time seems important.
Yeah, and absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the revelations I had, and then wanting to express, something that was meaningful in my life, and students come in and out of my life. Some stay in my life, some don't, and somehow, I thought it was a way to speak to that experience. But yeah, I mean, nothing's gonna last. I mean, that's one of the darker parts of the chapter is when she's talking about Lyotard's observations about the sun, and that's always looming in the background. It's like, eventually, if we're still here, we're going to have to go off planet. Hopefully it's not going to be what's his name taking us there, but Grimes's husband, Elon Musk. Yeah. Does anyone else have any?
Noah, do you have another?
There's a Kate Kelley also had a YouTuber. Okay, never mind. Sorry.
Sorry, Noah, did you want to chime in? I know you've hit your
Oh
hand.
yeah, I was just thinking about what Becky said with like the sort of a circular reasoning going on in the reading, and there was sort of this point. The point that I sort of latched onto was the Lyotard quote. He mentions the fantasy of extricating human intellect from its material shell. And John just mentioned we're going to have to go off planet, and this is the fantasy that I think he's talking about. But to my mind, a corollary of that is like the digitization of intelligence. I know we were just talking about NFTs, and so if extricating a human is this fantasy really is this fantasy, then there's a disconnect between Harrison's notion that photography has always been there, in fossils. Yeah, I don't know though. I think that I'm wondering if Lyotard is right about this. If extricating human intellect from its material shell is really a fantasy. Maybe there is an off ramp somewhere in the digital. In computer generated photography, if you think of like computers as producing fossils somehow or something like that.
Heavy. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's, I think of so much digital media, like modeling programs as being more akin to painting and like world building, but then back to the circular thinking here, but everything's taking place on our planet. So maybe this is a kind of weird fossilization at the same time. I don't know. It's getting pretty deep here.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, if it's everything that leaves an impression of one kind or another on some surface or medium as a photograph, right? It's like, it's kind of
it's everything. Yeah.
Where it's everything. Alex, you've had your hand up.
Hey. Hi, Alex.
Hi, John.
Hi.
I just, when going through the reading, I was honestly very surprised I saw Penelope Ambreco's work, because for her, she represents kind of an authorism where she collects all of these images online and she makes an assemblage of them and then uses it as a kind of saturation of images that we are constantly seeing, and how every image can kind of look on like it's like the same image over and over again. But then I started thinking about Penelope's work in collecting fossils, where she's looking on the ground and she's picking up stones and putting them in her pocket, taking them back to her studio and looking at them over and reassembling them in that kind of way. And there's a German photographer, I forgot his name, I can put it in the chat later, but all his life, he's just been collecting photographs that were on the ground and no authorship, no anything, no identification. And then he would just collect them and put it in his studio. And after decades of work, it's like he now has a library worth of all these images that were just abandoned, that were run over by cars, that were ripped in half. And when presenting this work, he just shows little fragments of kind of forgotten memories that have never seen the light of day. So it's an interesting kind of conversation when it comes to authorship, as well as collecting photographs as a fossil, as a rock that you just keep with you. And when presenting it to the public on, is this accepted or is this not? And I think for Ambreco, it's like she's put that kind of in the forefront of an accepted medium in some senses for photography. So I don't know, that's just what I was thinking when I was reading the book. But the whole idea of authorship really took me off guard, because in the first reading with Wall, it's much more about process and much more about kind of there's two sides of the coin when making an image. There's the wet side and the dry side. And then for the other text, it's like everything is doomed. What's the point? And it's just like, oh my God, like where is this going? So anyways.
Okay, I would say, where is he finding all these photographs on the ground? I wish I could find photographs on the ground like that. I would suspect there's a little bit of artifice there to drive that point home. But I think that's interesting in the sense that, yeah, I mean, I think the comparison you're drawing between finding a fossil and finding a photograph on the ground is perfectly in line with what's being said here. I'm not sure about the Ambreco idea. I don't know if anyone else wants to pick up on that. Oh yeah, I know that work.
The thing that I find really unconvincing that Zelenska does is talking about the sun as the energy source and the quintessential practice of life, because sun is the life-giving force. It's the life-giving source of energy, and she uses Ambreco as an example to do that turning from the kind of argument she's rehearsing with Lyotard, as Noah was talking about. And that is like, as somebody who is going through her writing and kind of deconstructing how she is going from one point to another, that's the point at which like I lose her and her sort of line of argument, because to me it is unconvincing that is the that like when we take pictures today with a digital phone, like somehow we are thinking about like the technicity and of the nature, and somehow we're thinking about the ecological crisis at hand. So I think that while argumentatively she's using it in a very skillful way, I don't go there with her if I really like break it down.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it does kind of fall apart about 75% into the text. I mean, there are some interesting granular things that I would just say too, and I have to admit, I have not read the book version of this chapter, but the version everybody was assigned or that we used for this is, I think, a very early version of this was a chapter that existed in another book. And I would suspect that she was probably working on other chapters. And so who knows? I admittedly have not actually read the book in its entirety. But I did notice that the chapter you guys read with Dan, the book version is actually very different. But I agree. I mean, I personally did find that confusing too. And in the sense that, I wasn't exactly sure what she was getting at, except the kind of the idea that if the sun weren't here, we wouldn't be here. And, we're the perfect distance from a star. And that's, the likelihood that we're even here is pretty interesting in itself. I don't know. I agree, Liz. I mean, and like you, I thought the last page was just like, what? Like, I don't know. I think someone else was. Leo, you have your hand
I
up
just
too,
want to ask Liz, actually, is it, I'm looking at the last sentence, and is it the even though that is the problem? Because saying that photography as an original practice of light, now often undertaken under the glow of electricity as often as under the glow of the sun, so something has changed, can get us to engage with light anew, that we're going to do something differently, even though in its present digital setup, it's also contingent upon energy borrowed from oil, a light distilled from death. And, she's talking about Bertinsky. It seems like there's an attempt to kind of embrace the Anthropocene, right? That the oil, the fossil fuels, transformation into plastics, digital technology, everything. and that it's not despite of that, but actually because of that, that there is a move into a kind of a new way of relating with light and relating with material, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think even though it does set it up so that it talks about that condition as a basis for her argument, but even though I actually don't think that this in itself is my problem. I think my problem is that looking at even the ecological crisis, like to me, like that doesn't, as she was saying, that doesn't necessarily address she's kind of repeating what she was saying. It doesn't necessarily address the problem. She says, the aesthetic becomes an anesthetic. And then she's doing the same thing at the very end. It's like,
Yeah.
Well, yes, there's this power of the sun. And, it's so like, I find that I understand the attempt at trying to kind of hold on to the power of photography and an attempt at rescuing the medium in some ways, but I don't know, not convinced, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not to defend her to the tooth or whatever the expression is, but I do think in a sense one needs to embrace paradox to maybe pick up on the poetics of what is being suggested. And with all of this kind of writing that's floating around right now, I think it's really the intent is to get us to understand ourselves in a different way. And we didn't, I mean, there are no solutions in this writing for me. It's just understanding what our true nature is, or what the nature of nature is. Again, back to like dissolving this traditional humanistic model of subject and object being separated somehow, which is,
well,
not going to help us moving forward.
On that note, much like much like Zelenska is provoking us to think about what to do with the remaining Anthropocene time we have left, I am thinking about what shall we do with the remaining thinking through photographs moments we have left. But I've got a solution. I just want to use this time to say a huge thank you to everyone. Thank you, John, especially for
thank you for inviting me.
Landing this ship on a really wonderful note, or I think a really fun and thoughtful note, and one that I know I'll keep thinking about. I especially want to thank Emily and Liz and Leo and Kate Kelley and just everyone. And I think Jillian's here, who was a wonderful part of the team, for putting together, again, what has been just a really fun and never ceases to not make me think about photography in a new way, which is really special for me. And thank you everyone for attending, any amount of sessions you've come to. It's really just been great for me to feel a sense of our photo community, our thoughtful art community being able to come together in what's obviously been a pretty shitty year. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Can't say more than that. Just a big thank you to everyone.
Hear, hear. Yeah. Is that it? Are we done?
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Cool.
Bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.